In the quiet rooms of a large house near Liverpool, a household began to listen too closely. Footsteps in the corridor. A door closing softly. The faint clink of a medicine glass. A servant pausing outside a room because something did not feel quite right. The man upstairs had been unwell for days. He was a merchant, known in the city, accustomed to travel, business, and the steady movement of ships and cotton across the Atlantic. He had complained before of nerves, of digestion, of strange sensations in his body. He had doctors, he had bottles, he had tonics, he had powders. In that time, medicine cabinets could be crowded and dangerous places, filled with substances that promised relief while carrying quiet risks of their own. But in this house, illness did not remain only illness. It became suspicion. The wife was young, American, and far from the world where she had been born. Her marriage had once looked elegant from the outside. There had been parties, callers, carriages, respectable rooms, and the appearance of comfort. But behind the polished surface were arguments, debt, loneliness, letters, and the heavy expectations placed on a woman whose private life had become the property of everyone around her. Then came a bottle of meat juice. Then came flypapers. Then came a letter, intercepted before it could leave the house. By the time the husband died, the family had already begun to divide itself into watchers and suspects. The servants had seen enough to whisper. The brothers had seen enough to intervene. Doctors were uncertain. The press was hungry. And a woman who had already been judged by the morals of her world was about to be judged by the law. Tonight, we return to a Victorian house where the central question was simple, and yet never simple at all. Did a wife poison her husband? Or did a court, a country, and an era decide that one kind of guilt was enough to prove another? Welcome back. Tonight's story is a true crime case from Victorian England, told calmly and carefully for nighttime listening. There will be no graphic detail, no sudden sounds, and no sensational retelling. This is a quiet walk through a documented case, one built from trial records, contemporary accounts, later historical analysis, and the words of the woman at the center of it. As you listen, you do not need to keep track of every date or every legal point. Let the story unfold at an easy pace. The important things will come back when they need to. A house, a marriage, an illness, a bottle, a courtroom, and a doubt that lasted long after the verdict was spoken. The case is the story of Florence Maybrick, born Florence Elizabeth Chandler in Mobile, Alabama. She became one of the most discussed women in the English-speaking world after the death of her husband, James Maybrick, in 1889. To some, she was a convicted poisoner. To others, she was a woman condemned by gossip, gendered morality, and uncertain science. More than a century later, the case still carries a strange, quiet power. It does not feel like a story with one clean line through it. It feels like a room full of objects, each one asking to be examined again. The medicines, the letters, the testimony, the judge's words, the public's reaction, and beneath all of it, the old and difficult question of whether the law heard the evidence clearly, or whether it heard scandal first. So settle in, let the lights lower, and let us begin. Not with the courtroom, but with the world that made the courtroom possible. Florence Elizabeth Chandler was born in Mobile, Alabama, in 1862, into a world still shadowed by the American Civil War and shaped by old ideas of family, status, reputation, and womanhood. Her father died before she was born, and her early life moved through changes of household and circumstance. By the time she was a teenager, she had spent time in the kind of social circles where manners mattered, appearances mattered, and a young woman's future was often understood through marriage. Across the ocean, James Maybrick was already an established man. He was a Liverpool cotton merchant, involved in the Atlantic trade that connected Britain and America through commerce, travel, and correspondence. He was more than 20 years older than Florence. When they met, she was still very young, and he was a man with money, Polish experience, and a worldliness that could easily impress someone whose life was just beginning to open. They met during travel across the Atlantic. It is one of those beginnings that can sound almost romantic when separated from everything that followed. A ship, the wide sea, conversation over several days, a young American woman, an older English businessman. In 1881, they married in London. For a time, the marriage could be seen as fortunate. Florence had married into comfort. James had married a striking young woman who drew attention. The couple lived for a period in America, and later settled in England, eventually making their home at Battlecrease House in Aigburth, near Liverpool. It was a substantial house, the sort of place meant to project steadiness. There were servants, children, callers, and the rhythms of respectable middle-class life. Florence and James had 2 children, a son and a daughter. To the outside world, this could appear to be the shape of success. A merchant husband, a young wife, a fine home, a family. But the Victorian home was often expected to hide its fractures. James was frequently away for business. Florence was far from Alabama, and far from the family networks that might have supported her. Liverpool society could be lively, but it could also be watchful. A woman in Florence's position was expected to manage the household, protect appearances, and remain morally above suspicion, even when the same standard was not always applied to men. James himself was not a simple figure. He had health complaints, particularly involving his nerves and digestion. He was known to use medicines and tonics, and many later accounts describe him as someone who took arsenic or arsenic-containing preparations. That detail matters deeply, because in the 19th century, arsenic did not occupy only the place it occupies in a modern imagination. It was poison, yes, but it was also present in certain medical preparations, cosmetics, pesticides, and household products. It could be found in places where we would now be startled to find it. This does not make arsenic harmless. It only means that, in James Maybrick's world, the boundary between medicine and danger was not always as clear as we might wish. A man could take powerful substances in the name of health. A household could contain poisons for practical purposes. Doctors could disagree. Symptoms could be interpreted in more than one way. Florence's life inside the marriage was also becoming troubled. There were debts, there were arguments, there were accusations. James had relationships outside the marriage, including a long-standing connection with another woman. In the moral climate of the time, however, a husband's infidelity could be treated as regrettable, even embarrassing, while a wife's infidelity could become ruinous. Florence also formed attachments outside her marriage. The most important for this story was with Alfred Brierley, a Liverpool cotton broker. Their relationship became part of the prosecution's case, not because it proved poisoning in itself, but because it was presented as motive. In the courtroom, adultery became a kind of emotional evidence. It suggested to many Victorian minds that a woman who had betrayed her marriage vows might be capable of other forms of betrayal. That was one of the quiet dangers surrounding Florence before James ever died. She was not only going to be judged for what could be proven about poison, she was going to be judged for what could be said about her character. In March of 1889, Florence travelled to London. The prosecution later described arrangements made under misleading names and claimed that Florence and Alfred Brierley stayed together as husband and wife. When Florence returned to Liverpool, the strain in the Maybrick household became more visible. James learned enough to be angry. There were quarrels. Servants heard things. Friends were drawn into attempts at reconciliation. At one point, Florence sought advice about separation. James was said to have threatened divorce. In Victorian society, divorce was not merely private pain. It was public disgrace, especially for a woman. It could affect custody, money, friendships, and social standing. For Florence, the walls of Battlecrease House must have felt very close. Still, the household continued. Doctors came and went. Servants worked. Children were cared for. Letters were written. James went to his office. Florence moved through the rooms of the house, and in the background, almost unnoticed until later, ordinary household things began to take on a darker meaning. Flypapers, medicine bottles, powders, a bottle of Valentine's meat juice. Each would later be held up in court as if it could speak clearly. But objects do not speak clearly on their own. People speak for them. And in this case, the people speaking did not all see the same story. The crime, as charged by the Crown, was the murder of James Maybrick by arsenic poisoning. But even at the beginning, there was a problem inside that sentence. For murder by arsenic to be proven, the prosecution needed to show not only that Florence had access to arsenic, and not only that she behaved suspiciously, but that arsenic administered by her caused James's death. That question, the medical question, became the heart of the case. It was also the place where certainty was hardest to find. In April of 1889, Florence bought flypapers from a local chemist. Flypapers at the time could contain arsenic. The prosecution said she soaked them in water in order to extract poison. A servant noticed flypapers soaking in a basin and found it strange. Florence later gave an explanation connected to cosmetic use, a practice not unknown at the time, though the meaning of the act remained disputed. It is easy, from a distance, to make the flypapers seem decisive. A woman accused of poison had bought and soaked something containing arsenic. But the house itself, according to later discussion of the case, contained many substances and preparations that complicated the picture. James's own alleged use of arsenic also complicated it. The presence of poison did not answer the question of who administered it, when, how much, and for what purpose. Late in April, James became ill. The illness was not immediately treated as murder. Doctors were called. His symptoms were understood by some in relation to digestive trouble. He had a history of complaints. He had taken medicines. Some accounts describe him as taking a dose of strychnine before becoming unwell. Another reminder that Victorian treatment could involve substances now associated with danger. The atmosphere in Battlecrease House shifted. A sick room has its own quiet tension. Curtains drawn or half-drawn. Footsteps softened. Cups and spoons placed carefully on trays. Doctors asking questions. Servants moving in and out, noticing more than they say. Family members beginning to wonder whether the illness is natural or not. In the Maybrick home, suspicion increased as the household became aware of Florence's continuing attachment to Alfred Brierly. A letter she wrote to Brierly was intercepted by Alice Yapp, the children's nurse. That interception was a turning point. The private became public within the household. Florence's words, intended for a lover, moved into the hands of people already inclined to distrust her. James's brothers became involved. Michael Maybrick, a successful singer and a strong family presence, took a leading role. Edwin Maybrick was also present in the unfolding events. Florence's authority in her own house weakened rapidly. The sick room was no longer only a place of care. It had become a place of surveillance. Then came the meat juice incident. Valentine's meat juice was a concentrated preparation, sometimes given to invalids. During James's illness, Florence was observed handling a bottle meant for him. A nurse became suspicious. The bottle was later found to contain arsenic. Florence said that James had asked her to put a powder into it, and that she had done so at his request. It is important to say that accounts of the case note, James did not drink that particular meat juice. This fact did not remove suspicion. It only shifted the question. If James did not consume the meat juice, then it could not have been the dose that killed him. But to the prosecution, it showed intent. To Florence and her supporters, it showed how easily an ambiguous act could be interpreted in the worst possible way once everyone in the house had decided to watch her. James Maybrick died at Battlecrease House on May 11th, 1889. He was around 50 years old. Florence was in her 20s. After his death, the suspicion that had been gathering became official. His body was examined. Arsenic was found in small amounts, but whether it was enough to cause death became deeply disputed. Some medical witnesses believed the death was consistent with arsenic poisoning. Others were not convinced. The body did not offer the clean answer that the public wanted. But the public was already listening. The press took hold of the story. It had everything a Victorian readership could be expected to consume eagerly. A wealthy household, a younger wife, an older husband, an alleged lover, poison, servants, intercepted letters, and the collapse of respectability behind closed doors. Florence was not going to enter the legal system as a blank figure. By the time she faced formal judgment, she had already become a character in a public drama. And that public drama was not gentle. The charge was murder. The method alleged was arsenic. The accused was a young American wife whose private life had become evidence. The investigation into James Maybrick's death was shaped almost from the beginning by suspicion inside the household. James's brothers did not accept his death as simply natural. The servants had observations to share. The intercepted letter suggested motive to those who already saw Florence as morally compromised. The flypapers suggested preparation. The meat juice suggested an act. The traces of arsenic suggested poison. Put together, these things formed a chain. But a chain can look strong from a distance and still have weak links. Florence was arrested and held. An inquest followed. The inquest did not settle the medical uncertainty in a way that satisfied everyone. But Florence was committed for trial. Her case would be heard at St. George's Hall in Liverpool, beginning on July 31st, 1889, before Justice James Fitzjames Stephen. The setting mattered. Liverpool was not neutral ground. The case had been discussed intensely in the local press. Many people had formed opinions. Florence herself later argued that she should not have been tried there. In her view, the city had already condemned her. Whether one accepts her argument fully or not, it is clear that the case had become a spectacle before the trial began. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution was led by John Addison. Florence was defended by Sir Charles Russell, one of the most respected advocates of his time. The indictment charged her with having, on May 11th, feloniously and with malice aforethought, killed and murdered James Maybrick. The prosecutions presented a story of motive, opportunity, and suspicious conduct. They described Florence's relationship with Alfred Brierly. They described the London trip. They described the quarrels that followed. They described the debts and the fear of exposure. They described the flypapers purchased and soaked. They described James's illness and Florence's access to him. They described the bottle of meat juice found to contain arsenic. The emotional logic was plain. Florence, trapped in an unhappy marriage and attached to another man, had reason to want James gone. But emotional logic is not the same as proof. The defense had several important points. James Maybrick was known, or at least strongly alleged, to have taken arsenic himself. He used medicines and tonics. His body contained only small traces of arsenic. The symptoms and post-mortem findings did not convince all medical experts that arsenic had caused death. The meat juice, though suspicious, had not been consumed, and the presence of arsenic in the home could not, by itself, prove that Florence administered a fatal dose. Sir Charles Russell worked to separate moral disapproval from criminal proof. A wife's adultery, however painful and socially condemned, was not murder. A suspicious act was not necessarily a fatal act. A household containing poison was not the same as a proven poisoning. Florence made a statement in court. She denied murdering her husband. She admitted conduct that damaged her reputation. but she did not admit the crime. The courtroom heard her, not as a witness cross-examined in the modern sense, but through the procedure available at the time. Her words mattered emotionally, but they could not erase the atmosphere around her. Justice Stevens' role became one of the most controversial parts of the case. His summing up to the jury was later criticized as hostile, confused, and overly moralistic. Critics argued that he placed too much weight on Florence's adultery and invited the jury to see moral guilt as a pathway to criminal guilt. Later legal scholars and historians have pointed to the Maybrick case as an example of why criminal appeals were urgently needed in Britain. At the time, there was no modern court of criminal appeal available to review a conviction in the way later generations would expect. The jury found Florence Maybrick guilty. She was sentenced to death. The reaction was immediate and intense. Many people believed the verdict was unsafe. Petitions circulated. Doctors, lawyers, public figures, and ordinary citizens questioned whether the evidence proved murder beyond reasonable doubt. The case became international. Florence was American, and many in the United States followed her fate closely. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, reviewed the case. The final decision was strange and unsatisfying. Florence's death sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. The reasoning accepted that she had administered or attempted to administer arsenic with intent to murder, but acknowledged reasonable doubt about whether the arsenic had actually caused James's death. For Florence and her supporters, that decision was deeply troubling. If there was reasonable doubt about whether arsenic caused the death, they argued, how could the murder conviction remain the basis for punishment? She had not been tried separately for attempted poisoning. Yet she was spared the gallows, only to be sent into years of imprisonment. On August 29th, 1889, Florence was removed to Woking Prison. Her life narrowed to cells, rules, silence, labor, and the long passage of days. In her memoir, published after her release, she described solitary confinement as one of the cruelest features of English penal servitude. She wrote of silence, cold, monotony, and the mental strain of being cut off from ordinary human exchange. She was later moved to Aylesbury Prison. Years passed. Public interest rose and fell. Campaigners continued to press for her release. Her children grew up without her. The life she had known in Battlecrease House vanished completely. Florence was released in January 1904, after more than 14 years in custody. But release did not restore what had been taken. It did not give her back her children's childhood. It did not give her back her youth. It did not erase the conviction. It did not settle the question. It only opened the prison door. In a formal legal sense, the case did not remain unsolved. Florence Maybrick was convicted of murdering James Maybrick. The court gave its answer. The state punished her. The record, for many years, carried that conclusion, but historically and morally, the case remains unsettled. That is why it still draws attention. The first reason is the medical evidence. Arsenic was found, but the amount and significance were disputed. Some experts believed James died from arsenic poisoning. Others believed the evidence did not prove that. James had a history of taking medicines and, according to many accounts, arsenic. If he was already using arsenic, then traces in the body were not simple proof of murder. The question was not merely whether arsenic existed. The question was whether Florence administered a fatal amount, and whether that amount caused death. The second reason is the meat juice. The bottle was one of the most suspicious objects in the case. It contained arsenic. Florence had handled it. But James did not drink from that bottle. If he did not drink it, then it could not explain his death. It could suggest intent, depending on how one interprets Florence's actions. But it could not serve as the fatal administration. The third reason is the flypaper evidence. Florence bought and soaked arsenic-containing flypapers. That was suspicious. But the defense argued that there could be other explanations, including cosmetic use. Whether that explanation convinces a listener today may vary. Still, suspicion is not the same as proof of murder, and the amount of arsenic involved in the flypapers had to be understood alongside all the other possible sources of arsenic in the household. The fourth reason is the moral atmosphere. Florence's adultery was real, and in the eyes of Victorian society, it was devastating. But the courtroom's focus on her sexual conduct created a risk that the jury would punish her character, rather than decide only the poisoning charge. James's own extramarital life did not carry the same weight in the proceedings. That imbalance is one of the reasons the case became important to women's rights advocates and critics of Victorian law. The fifth reason is the judge's summing up. Justice Stephen was a major legal figure, but his handling of the case has long been criticized. Later commentators argued that he confused evidence, emphasized morality, and gave the jury a framework that was damaging to Florence. In a modern system, such concerns might form the basis of an appeal. At the time, Florence had no ordinary path to a full criminal appeal. The sixth reason is the Home Office decision. The government did not simply say the conviction was sound and the sentence should stand. It commuted the death sentence because there was reasonable doubt about whether arsenic caused James's death. That left the case in a peculiar position. Florence was not executed because the fatal element of murder was uncertain. Yet she remained imprisoned for life because the authorities believed she had intended to poison him. This halfway answer satisfied almost no one. To those convinced of Florence's guilt, the commutation looked too merciful. To those convinced of her innocence, or at least of reasonable doubt, the continued imprisonment looked like punishment without a properly proven crime. And so the case remained suspended between verdict and doubt. It is possible to look at the facts and believe Florence behaved suspiciously. It is possible to believe she may have administered arsenic at some point. It is also possible to look at the same facts and believe the prosecution failed to prove murder. That distinction matters. The law is not supposed to ask whether someone is easy to suspect. It is supposed to ask whether the specific charge has been proven beyond reasonable doubt. That is the quiet center of the Maybrick case. Not whether Florence was perfect. She was not. Not whether her marriage was troubled. It was. Not whether there were suspicious objects in the house. There were. The question is whether those facts proved that she murdered James Maybrick. And after all these years, the answer remains shadowed. After her release, Florence Maybrick returned to the United States. She tried to rebuild a life in a country that was hers by birth, but no longer simple home. For a time, she spoke publicly about prison reform. She described the conditions she had endured and argued against solitary confinement and the silent system. She was no longer only the woman from the trial. She became, in her own way, a witness to punishment. But public attention is rarely steady. The world that had once consumed every detail of her case eventually moved on. New scandals came. New trials filled newspapers. New names replaced old ones. Florence lived under the weight of a story that could never fully release her. In later life, she used her maiden name, Florence Chandler. She lived quietly in Connecticut, far from Battlecrease House, far from St. George's Hall, far from the crowds that had once watched her as though she were an exhibit. She died in 1941 in Gaylordsville, Connecticut, in modest circumstances. By then, the Victorian world that condemned her was gone. The courtroom was history. The servants were gone. The doctors were gone. The brothers were gone. James Maybrick had been dead for more than half a century. But the question remained. There is something especially haunting about cases like this, where the official ending arrives but does not bring peace. The law spoke. The sentence was passed. The prison years were served. Yet the story never settled into certainty. It continued to move quietly through books, articles, legal discussions, and the memories of people interested in the failures and blind spots of justice. Florence Maybrick's case asks us to listen carefully to the space between suspicion and proof. It asks us to notice how quickly a woman's reputation could become evidence against her. It asks us to remember that science in a courtroom must be clear enough to carry the weight placed upon it. And it asks us to consider the human cost of uncertainty, when uncertainty is not enough to save a person from punishment. In the end, Florence's story is not only about poison, it is about the danger of deciding who someone is before deciding what they have done. It is about a house where illness became accusation. It is about a trial where morality and evidence became dangerously entwined. It is about a woman spared from death, but not from years of silence. And it is about a verdict that still echoes, softly and uneasily, through the rooms of a house long emptied of its voices. Thank you for listening tonight. This has been the story of Florence Maybrick and the death of James Maybrick, a true crime case from Victorian England, where the official verdict never fully quieted the doubts around it. As you rest, let the story drift back into history. The courtroom doors close. The rain on the windows grows softer. The papers are folded away. And the old house, with all its questions, settles once more into the dark.